But the lives of dark people, the lives of people who are being oppressed, that's like just killing a dog. The elements who are supporting Zuma are the more corrupt. They are now prepared to support the most corrupt persons. And it's not that black people are just the ones who are corrupt. The corruptees are actually white business ever since Israel came into being, which is a settler colonial state of Jews from Europe, essentially.
Back to Palatable Politics, Season 2. With me, host TJ Maslela. Welcome to the show, where we make politics palatable. Today, we are joined by a strategist, a revolutionary, communist. He's been a deputy minister under Nelson Mandela, minister under Thabo Mbeki, seasoned activist, Mr. Ronnie Kasrils. Welcome to the show.
Nice to be with you, thanks. Did
welcome.
you say GNU?
The initial one.
Yeah, it wasn't called a GNU really at that stage.
Yeah, the National
That was
Unity.
the first Mandela administration.
Okay.
Yeah.
You'll take us through it. Take us through it. But let's start there. How did you get involved in the movement and fighting apartheid, and why?
Okay, so it's unusual for a young white kid to grow up through the South African school system in the period of apartheid to get involved. By 1960, the Sharpeville massacre. There were a few, but we're talking about, like a few hundred in the whole country, if that. The whites involved were minority of a minority, and a lot in the previous period, like from the 20s, 30s, 40s, were from the Communist Party, which was banned. When I grew up in Yeovil, as an ordinary kid, mad about sport, not terribly interested in school, and I hated the education system without realizing why. It was just so dull, stuffy, and about the Great Trek and, Van Riebeck. But my parents were kind people. They were immigrants from Eastern Europe, the Russian Empire, Jewish. And quite a few, a minority of those Jews, but quite a few had imbibed a bit of socialism from the Bolsheviks. My parents had, and my mother particularly, had a cousin who was a communist, who I met when I was a tiny kid. She was living in Durban. So that didn't affect me, but they were just kind people. So they would say to me that I must respect everybody. Everyone, they would say, in case they thought I was thinking respect all white people. So my mother particularly would say to me, you must never use these dreadful words, which you could hear all the time, N words, K words, etc. And because we were Jewish, and it was the war against fascism in Europe, against Nazi Germany, one imbibed this feeling of hatred for fascism, what they were doing to Jewish people there. And I used to quiz my mother and say, is this what they do to blacks in this country? It's like how they behave to Jews in Europe. She said, look, that's much worse. But Ronald, my formal name, it starts that way. It starts exactly the way you see it in this country. And I was in town with her at the cinema. We saw a black guy and really neatly dressed, like Sophia Town guys. And he refused to get off the pavement. And these young white thugs attacked him and beat him senseless. And, of course, I was shocked. My mother was shocked, and she said, that is the most horrible thing, that's the bad things in this country, and so on. And my father was a working class guy, and he talked about the right of people to a decent wage. And he meant blacks or whites. So they had that kind of kindness. That rubbed off me. I write about it in my book, Armed and Dangerous. I could go on about it. But essentially it meant when I was in matric now, 17, 18, I was attracted to jazz music, poetry, and you found this amongst black people particularly, the reporters, the poets, the jazz musicians. So I actually started making friends, which was very unusual for white people. And I crossed the colour line and I had these friends. Sharpeville happens, which shocked me to the core. But the guys who
You're also giving away your age?
I don't mind that. I'm a Mandela, so people must know, the young people must take over the baton from the Mandelas. I'm younger by about, 18, 20 years than the Mandela generation. But this is really why we tell our stories, to inspire young people of all backgrounds to stand up against injustice. I was shocked by the Sharpeville massacre. And then the friends I had were rather these bohemian types. So they didn't really take action. They bemoaned what was happening. And I thought, if I'm going to be a South African, because a lot of whites who were liberal would go abroad, and I loved this country, but I thought, I can only stay here if I do something, otherwise I'm just another white. So click, this cousin of my mother's, the communist who was in Durban, and she was a treason trialist. Her name was Jacqueline Orenstein.
Okay.
And I went to see her to ask her what I could do. And as it happened, her husband, who was a people's lawyer and very involved as a communist in the struggle, like her, he had gone underground. So the special branch knew all these whites wherever Cape Town, Joburg, Durban. And, the whites were living in white areas and they were isolated from communities who would help them, unlike if you were a black or an Indian activist or mixed race. So here was this young 20-year-old guy, and she needed me as a go-between between her and her husband, who was underground. And so I got very involved in underground work. That took me into the Congress movement, and I became involved very quickly in Umkhonto weSizwe when it started, because he has this young, quite physically fit, sportsman, etc., young white guy. You need them as soldiers, in the army. So I was recruited from the inception, got involved in all these sabotage actions. People were arrested. I was lucky. The police were after me. The underground sent me out the country for military training, and I ended up in Dar es Salaam working for the ANC.
This is also the point where you encountered Che Guevara.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
1963 to 65. He's
Can you
there
tell us
in
about that moment?
1965.
Okay, can you tell us about that moment? What he said, how it felt?
Yes, well, by then we had been reading all about him. He was a hero of everybody's, very charismatic. We studied his writings on guerrilla warfare already inside South Africa. And the Cuban embassy came to the ANC, spoke to the leaders, told them that Che was in town. He had been involved in the Congo in trying to help a guerrilla struggle develop there, which didn't really take place. So he's now kind of 65, mid-65, I would think it could have been, in Dar es Salaam. And the leadership take me along to the Cuban embassy, where about 100 or more comrades from the various liberation movements have been invited, and Che is there. Unbelievable. You kept pinching yourself. Is this Che Guevara? You couldn't believe it. And he delivers a lecture which was very inspiring, very encouraging.
What did you take from that?
So, about the commitment to struggle and how guerrilla warfare is the struggle of the weak without the resources of the oppressor, and how with the correct application of guerrilla warfare by the oppressed, the underdogs, you can confront the oppressor, and using guerrilla tactics, hit and run and links with the people, the roots with the people. Without that, you're not going to win. How you can, in the end, build up a mass insurrectionary struggle led by guerrillas, guerrilla struggle and guerrilla commander leaders, etc. But there was some debate, because the one thing that he mentions, which none of the organizations took on board and accepted, was what we would call a domino effect. So he said the colonialists are very powerful in southern Africa, where the Portuguese are ruling, in Angola and Mozambique, the white Rhodesians in what we call Zimbabwe, what is Zimbabwe, Namibia as well, and of course South Africa, and including the Congo, where he had been striving to develop the struggle. It was ostensibly, not like the others, ostensibly independent with its own flag and a black leader, Mobutu, but still the need for a struggle there. And he said we should all get together in a people's mass army and fight them one by one, like take down the Congo, go on to Angola, go on to Mozambique, then to Namibia, then to Zimbabwe, and then South Africa. It wasn't just the South Africans who felt, we lost in the queue, we've got to get on with our struggle now. It applied to everybody. So from that point of view, it was quite a robust, and he took it quite well, debate, but it really didn't take traction with us, and we got on simultaneously with our own struggles in our own country. So I believe he was actually wrong in that. Yeah. Let me just say that one didn't have a chance to really even there shake his hand. I can't remember, we might all have, there were about 100, and it was the top leaders who had a little bit of a tete-a-tete with him.
Who were the top leaders? Who were the top leaders present?
Yes. People like Tambo and Marcelino dos Santos and Neto and Cormo, all of these people. But I bumped into him the next day. He was going for a walk on the boulevard along the seashore. And there I was, and my luck was that I was wearing a maroon beret that one of the women in MK realized that I liked it very much. She had come out of the country with a maroon beret and she had given it to me. So I was going for a walk with this beret on, and I bumped into a friend of mine from the Cuban embassy who was taking him for a walk along the seashore. And we had a very brief chat. And he said, wow, that looks very attractive on you, a real guerrilla fighter, and so on. We just had a little exchange like that.
Yeah. I don't know how I would have felt. Having met him just
I felt like out of my mind, over the moon, one of the greatest little rendezvous of my life.
So, in your journey in the fight against apartheid, you sacrificed a lot. I mean, you moved to a period where you didn't see your kids.
No, my kids weren't born. I was a 20-year-old when I left. So, my kids were born abroad.
Yeah, in London, right?
Yes, because I was based there for some time.
What was your biggest loss? The thing you sacrificed the most in the struggle?
Well, I don't think of it that way.
Okay.
I think that I was so fortunate to be able to join the struggle of Bantu, South Africa. It changed my life, yes. In a superficial sense, I could have remained a white boy, maybe with liberal ideas. I'd been working in a film studio, something of a writer out of school. And, I'd look back there and I'd think I probably would have gone on to be a great movie maker. It would have been in South Africa. Maybe I would have left. Is there anything that could have been better than becoming part of the struggle? Yes, dangerous. You sacrificed. The question of You went for years without making money. We were volunteers. So, the ANC in exile looked after us in the camps. And if you worked in an office or so, you could get married, which I did. But this was the most wonderful thing that's ever happened to me in my whole life. So I don't think of it as a sacrifice. Really, I don't. I look on it as an incredible gain. Okay.
A privilege.
But I know what you mean by sacrifice. The people who were arrested, who were tortured, who were beaten, let alone those who died in the struggle. That's the ultimate sacrifice. Sacrifice of being arrested and going to Robben Island, going to Pretoria security prison where the whites were kept for 10, for 15, for over 20, 25 years. What a sacrifice that is. But even them, they survived it, they came out, and they never regretted what had occurred. So I don't come across people who say, oh, what I sacrificed, except those who, for reasons of their own, will bemoan what has happened. We didn't really get on in life, and, we didn't become wealthy, and so on, that kind of appeal. But for me, it's not that aspect. So, as I've said, I regard myself as very fortunate.
Okay. And then the part of the questions and struggles you had with yourself, in your book, there was the one part of where you're asking yourself, would killing have saved a life or brought freedom sooner? How do you feel about that now? Do you obviously if you were against taking a life, that's not why you got in it. You got in it for...
people in liberation struggle are fighters for freedom and justice, and ultimately for peace and security for their people and for the world, not for domination, not for injustice. So we would teach our young people joining the struggle that, look, here is a gun, we're going to teach you how to use this gun, and say that to the 1976 generation, which was the next generation after we were the 1961. And after the 1976 students' uprising, hundreds, even thousands, come into exile. They want a gun to come back to fight the Amabuno, Bulala Amabuno, as our song went, meaning the system. They might think of it as people. We would say to them, okay, here's a gun. We've got to fight. We've got to kill where necessary, because that's a struggle to free our people. But this is a weapon to secure peace. We don't like to kill people, but we have to, because they're defending a system, and that system is keeping our people cruelly oppressed, brutally exploited, and so on. People die in so many ways, whether in massacres by the whites, or down the mines, or through illness, through the life expectancy of black people, because of the nature of the conditions of their lives is cut so short. So we are fighting for life and to create a country where there's peace, not conflict. And that's drilled in, and that becomes part of one. So any freedom fighter, the Che Guevaras, the Patrice Lumumbas, okay, he gets murdered. He wasn't in an armed struggle. Sacrifices his life. But, the Red Army against the Nazis, you're killing because you have to stop this brutality, this killing of innocent people, such as what's going on in Palestine to this day.
Which we will come to.
Yes. So from that point of view, when you grasp this idea and you understand it, as the young kids who join us, who just said, we want to have a gun, teach us how to fire it, so we go back, we're going to just kill Boers. When they get the politics and the understanding, they see the difference between the oppressors, the racists, the fascists, the imperialists, who For them, life doesn't matter, only their own lives and people. But the lives of dark people, the lives of people who are being oppressed, that's like just killing a dog, that kind of thing. For us, life is something that's precious, and that's what we fight for. So it becomes part of your nature. And once you're fighting in that respect, you carry on, because you know you have really a just struggle, and you have to use, although you don't wish to, you'd rather have, as our leaders from the Mandelas and the Tambos and the Yusuf Dados, that we would rather get peace. We'd rather get freedom, through non-violent struggle. But when that's impossible, then we go for the weapons, because that's the only way forward. So it's not a big problem in one's mind in the end.
Makes sense. So now we're coming back. Okay, I know there's a lot of the story. I mean, we could talk about it for hours. But for those that want to know the detail, there are many books out there that he's authored. Armed and Dangerous, Simple Man, what's the other one? The one about your story?
The Unlikely Secret Agent, about my former wife who was in MK.
Yes.
And was arrested and escaped from imprisonment. We left the country together. And then there's a book about
her name Eleanor.
Eleanor,
yes.
Okay. Yes.
Okay, yeah. So those are books you can definitely read. Now, coming back to Exile's done. It's not done, but now we're opening up conversations about coming back. There's Codessa. Walk us through what happened there. The key points in terms of where you think we went right and where you think we went wrong.
Okay, so if you don't mind, just a little background to that. As you say, we 30 years from the time of forming Umkhonto weSizwe, and the period that in 1962, 64, our leaders are all arrested in the Rivonia raid, the Rivonia trial. The underground is smashed in the country, which is why Exile is the area where struggle begins to be focused, to build up our power outside through military, political training, underground training, and
with the
try
support
and
of
get
the
back
Russians
and training in Cuba, in the Soviet Union, in East Germany, GDR, in African states, Algeria, Egypt, Ethiopia, and so on, Tanzania. These are, and especially, by the way, Angola and Mozambique. But Angola becomes the main base after its liberation, 75. Okay. So we're getting stronger outside. There's big battles with the frontline states, especially in Angola and what we call the Boers, the old SADF. We infiltrate the country. Armed actions are taking place. We're getting stronger, and there's strikes from the early 70s. There's the student uprising in 76. So workers, students, and youth, civil society, as we'd call it today, the community struggle, the workers' struggle, this gets very big. Okay. And in the 80s, it's sort of beginning to overwhelm the apartheid system, reinforced by our armed struggle and international solidarity, which isolates Pretoria more and more and puts pressure on the governments like the USA, Britain, France, West Germany, who are supporting apartheid. It gets to the point where they can't control the situation. And they're very worried that there's going to be a red revolution. But the Soviet Union collapses in 1990-91, and they begin to feel, both these Western, former colonialist, imperialist countries, USA, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and so on, and Japan, by the way, but the big business in South Africa, the Oppenheimers, the Ruperts, and so on, together with these Western advisors from those countries, are saying, You've got nothing to worry about now from communism. The Soviet Union has collapsed, but these black masses are going to overthrow you. You'd better start talking with these terrorists led by Mandela and Oliver Tambo outside and do a deal with them, offer them political change, and in the meantime, you'll hold on to the economic heights in the country, the real economic power, the mines, the mineral wealth, the land, etc. So they began to send out feelers for negotiation. And that's already beginning to take place in the late 80s. They're speaking to Mandela in the prisons. They're meeting some top leaders, Thabo Mbeki and Zuma.
Zambia.
And Aziz Pahad, very secretly outside. The comrades aren't giving us away. They're not throwing their hands up, and they can't talk about it because these are just initial discussions and contacts to see if it's possible for a peaceful, negotiated change. And that's where the talks begin and begin to take off, leading, as you say, to the CODESA process, which was a sort of multi-party initiative of having discussions about the nature and the process of change. And that's the point that you've raised. So what I want our viewers to understand is that the breakthrough from armed struggle and mass insurrection towards the regime relenting and beginning to talk and saying that they'll release Mandela and political prisoners, they'll lift the ban on the ANC and the PAC and the Communist Party. They're willing to discuss the process of such a change. They're willing to allow all people the right to vote, which is like an absolute, such a radical change.
So one man, one vote.
Towards that universal franchise, one person, one vote, and so
on. One person,
on.
Yes, okay.
So that's the negotiation, and within that, what basically happens between 1990 and 1994, when we have our first democratic election for non-racist democratic South Africa, is the passing of political power and control to the majoritarian party, the one that gets most votes in the election, and the ANC. And that becomes the ruling party of government. Okay. In the process, the question of what happens to the economic control is always the big bugbear, because these forces, whether they are colonial power, talking with a colonized power about passing from colonial rule to black independence, or the same in Asia or South America, to the brown peoples of those continents, is the colonialists, and in our case the white rulers here, but the political elite, the wealthy business, mine owners, is they'll give up in the end where they can't manage the system, politics, political power, but the economic mustn't be touched. Maybe some degree they'll allow black people to get some element of the economy, but very little. And what was the fact of that was that Mandela and the leadership, in terms of the negotiations, had to work out, okay, will we go gashly in relation to the control of the economy, or do we take a stand now? If we do, then it's still going to be war, and they're more powerful than us. Okay. But if we go along with the idea of the political power passing to us, we will then, when we're in power, begin to make inroads in relation to who's controlling the economy. But that's the period we then entered after 1994. And we've seen, we are now over 30 years since, how difficult it is to wrestle the economic controls, of power and wealth from the economic elite.
So
And
if I
that's
get what
the
you're
problem
saying,
we face.
if I understand what you're saying correctly, right, is that fine, we understood that this is not going to be an easy transition. We're not going to get it all. To make it peaceful, we have to find one another. So they didn't sell out, but they made it compromises to say we will get the political power and then we'll use the political power to get the economic power.
Kwame Nkrumah, who's regarded as like, the most outstanding of the early black leaders, and who, by the way, the PAC and people who talk about black consciousness absolutely idolized. But he basically went along with what Mandela went along with, because in his philosophy and his political theory of the time, Ghana became independent in 1957.
Okay.
And he spoke about first comes the political kingdom, and then comes the economic kingdom. Okay, kingdom in a metaphorical sense. I'm sure the listeners will understand that. Get your political power. You now have power. You see, without political power, you're nothing. But if you've got political power, then you've got certain power. You know that the business people, together with those internationally, international capital, so the capitalists of your country and international capital, that they control the economy. But with the political power, you can start making inroads. But it's very difficult. You have to be very bold. You've got to have a very active people who are very politically aware. You've got to have strong trade unions and community organizations, so that you've got leverages of power to ensure that they start giving up aspects of the land, that you can push through a nationalization of the mining houses, of the key industries, and begin through a nationalization of the heights of the economy, get the nationalized companies and corporates in popular people's hands, so that the wealth can be distributed through to the people, a la the promises and aspirations of the Freedom Charter, 70 years anniversary today. But it's very, very difficult if you don't have the will and that organization of real mass power and might to bring to bear the pressures on the political and economic elites in the country.
So where do you think we went too far in terms of the compromises that made it difficult for us to now get the economic kingdom?
Well, from the 90s, even earlier, what is taking place in the world economy is the move towards global neoliberalism, which is a system of global capital in which the huge corporates, the monopoly capitalists of the world, have become so powerful that your little economy gets sucked in unless you take a strong stand from the beginning and you stand against it. You can only do that if you've got backing of the people and that they're very clear about that situation. I would say, with all due respect to our leaders of the time, that there was a belief that we couldn't stand up to that kind of power. The Soviet Union had collapsed. We didn't have a major world power that could assist us. China was still going through its transformation. It wasn't the China of today. So
Do you think we have that now? Do you think we're in a position?
It's becoming possible. We can see the possibilities through the power of China and Russia now, after its collapse, standing up against NATO, which is the military tool of Western capital, to make countries bow down to them. always for the economic resources. It's always there at the base. It's all about money, in fact. Money in the big sense of the profits, of the resources from the land and mines and factories, etc. So it's beginning, and we see it with BRICS and the global south becoming stronger. We see the breakthroughs. Take the Western Sahara, the Sahel, Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, Ibrahim Traore, the new hero of Africa. But we see this in Latin America and in Asia as well, from countries like Colombia to Chile to Brazil, countries which are standing up against the imperialists and refusing just to bow down. And in India, in Asia as well, India becoming strong alongside China. We see the struggles of the Middle East and the imperialists trying to control the Middle East because they want to control those resources. I know we've gone ahead in your interview, so we can come back to our situation where our people need to understand that at that point in time, capitalism internationally is so strong. We had hoped and expected that the Soviet Union would dominate with China and Vietnam and Cuba, and instead it collapses. So we then have a unipolar world of the American empire, and all the colonial powers of Europe just are like their running dogs, you know, their little poodles and so on, taking orders. And their power is running the show. And we see how they dealt with Iraq, for instance, how they've dealt with Syria recently, how they're trying to deal with Iran. And this is how they were dealing with countries who were struggling against them. So it wasn't only South Africa that, in a sense, succumbs, gets sucked into this new global capitalism that's so concentrated that it can control and run trade and business in the whole world virtually, except the Chinese are challenging and so on. So we see countries like Angola also getting pulled into that kind of orbit, Mozambique as well, and, you know, wherever you're looking. And that's what we must understand when we say, did our people compromise too much? Did they sell out? I would say that it's more an error of judgment feeling that, hey guys, we've got to now begin to pull back. If we try to boldly go forward, we've got to get our heads cracked. So we've got to learn how to live in this new economic system, which is global. And that globalization means you can't, as a country, ignore the world economy and think you can better things just within your own borders. This is what that globalism was all about. So this is why I keep saying we sucked into it. However, we can't simply say, therefore, there's nothing to learn, we just had to do it. You always look back and you say, could have we done things differently? And in relation to that, I think the big thing we lost was in 1994, we had very strong trade union movement. It was totally united. The working class were very class conscious, and there was a huge optimism amongst our people, from the workers and the youth particularly, that we could advance and do stronger things, such as nationalization on the one hand, putting taxes on the rich and on the corporates. That way you get huge sums of money into your treasury to spend for the advance of the country and the building of infrastructure, housing and roads and railways, and the control of mines and industry to make the country work better. But the global economy and the teaching through the Harvard universities and so on in all these countries is very strong in terms of getting across the idea through the World Bank and the IMF,
the Bretton Woods institution.
This is the only way you can advance. So here I'm going to be critical subjectively about some of our people who I feel brought too much for the best interests into that route without realizing that we were becoming captives to this new thinking. So that thinking will advance through capitalism. Pre to that, we were really orientated, certainly the ANC as a national movement, towards a socialism. And of course the Communist Party as well. But the Communist Party tended to keep on side with the ANC too much.
It's only now which they've made a decision to.
It wasn't flexing its muscles and so on. So it's in that context that we need to understand. I mean, I'm putting it very simply. In how detailed, but in broad brushstrokes, so that now when we're looking at the way to go, we have to start breaking away from this hegemony of the idea that everything is about capital and everything's about making personal wealth, which is how it filters down to people then who are in leading positions, who put their own self-interests above the interest of the people, and we no longer then have a situation of political organization. So not only in South Africa, where what is decisive to people is that serving oneself. I'll get myself better and my family better. No longer the question of what we must be about is serving the people as the absolute core of what we're all about and solving the problems of the people. So I'll come to an end on this, the last point here, that if we now to resolve all the problems and questions, the loss of votes that the ANC has suffered from the 2004 election of President Mbeki was 69.8 or 9%, just under 70. And it came down, the vote came down to 40% in 2024. Just look at that. That's why we now have a GNU in terms of a watering down of the policy. And will we manage to get out of this kind of problem when power is being shared at that national level?
Do you think the GNU is going to work?
Well, look, to some degree, people are surprised that it's lost a year. There's big question marks. I'm not going to commit myself to saying, no, it won't. I'm not looking into a glass ball that says next year it will fail. It's obviously fraught with huge contradictions because you've got different parties that are serving different interests in the population. And I'm talking about parties from the DA to the Freedom Front Plus to ACDP, which look to the USA, which look to the West as the way we should go. And we see the world is equally divided between countries from Russia to China, Vietnam, and the global South against the former colonial countries and the USA. And we've got people in this country, social groupings, etc., who look to the USA and that old way, that aspect of capital, which has failed the world miserably and thrown the world into these dreadful conflicts that face us to this day.
You know, okay, fine. So we come back, governments will leave the first term. I want to focus more on the second term because I've got a personal interest in it. That I've always seen that there's a strong correlation between a country's economy and its intelligence. And you now served in intelligence, which was one of the better years which our country was performing economically. What is it that was happening during that term that we are not seeing today?
Well,
One, is there a correlation?
okay. In terms of intelligence, in terms of the military, in terms of social welfare, whatever arm of government, police, the courts, you will only advance if you have a state. These are all state institutions and structures that serve the will of the people. And you find the will of the people through the electorate. In the earlier period when I'm Minister of Intelligence, and I've already mentioned that in 2004, Mbeki wins almost 70% of the vote, the apex of the power that the ANC has, and where you would think that the state, because the state or these institutions that are permanently there, housing, education, and so on, intelligence, and the government who gets voted in every 5 years. And yet I become Minister of Intelligence and I find it divided. And I begin to realize, because it's all happening invisibly, that there are elements there that are actually looking at succession past Mbeki and are siding with a simple man, as I use the term in my book about Jacob Zuma, because he's far from a simple man. He projects himself as a simple man. He's far from it. That's the title of the book, A Simple Man. And here are elements and at the top in intelligence who are split. The most energetic force is wanting to push Mbeki aside and bring in Zuma. That now we find happening throughout state structures, and the ANC is split and divided. And that's how this thing, like I was going to say a rotten fruit, opens up, because the rot was setting in. And I would say that the elements who are supporting Zuma are the more corrupt, and beginning to see, well, this way, instead of the ANC going on about we serve the people, we're not serving ourselves, it's these guys who are already taking bribes and the corruption's becoming embedded, that they are now prepared to support the most corrupt person.
So that they can eat.
So they can eat more, yeah, as simple as that. Now it becomes more complex because you actually find forces on the left. Okay. So COSATU and the Communist Party are also going along with that move to get rid of Mbeki, not so much for a motivation or an agenda that I've referred to of self-interest, but more because they are viewing Mbeki as standing in the way of a more decisive progress for the workers. They feel there's been a sellout in relation to the economy, and there's an element of this which is factual in that we had, from the time we started in 1994, the RDP. Okay. And now from
the RDP, the Reconstruction and Development Plan
program.
Oh, program. Okay. Yeah.
And now with Mbeki brings in 1996 what was called GEAR. Okay. And that's more towards a privatization program in effect. And we're looking to the World Bank. Trevor Manuel makes his speech in 1992 in relation to that. Up until that time, we're supposed to be going for a macroeconomic policy based on the Freedom Charter. But with that speech of Trevor's, and clearly he could only be projecting it if the president and deputy president of the ANC are in favour and pushing it. That's Mandela and Mbeki. But I would say and they outstanding leaders of our country. But they, I would say, are believing that we must go gashly with the World Bank and the imperialists. This is the way to survive and to grow.
And this was the NEC of 92, right?
Yes.
Where?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's a very complex period, but I'm again in broad brushstrokes trying to say what's the change that takes place and the complexity, so that as we go through a very positive period, because under Mbeki we get to a point in 2004 or so where the GDP is now 6%, the highest we've ever had. So and I might be sounding critical of him. I'm trying to look at a bigger picture, and I'm saying that there's no sellout as such. I feel that the judgment that we took was incorrect, but these are people from Mandela and Mbeki who are not corrupt, who are absolutely committed to finding a way from the political control into the economic, and they bring in black economic empowerment and stuff of that nature, which unfortunately only really assists the top echelon of black society. So
from an ownership part, I guess the management has been a bit different.
Exactly.
But on there, I just have a question, one that puzzled me a bit and actually led me to read the book about the Simple Man. In Armed and Dangerous, you briefly touch on your interactions with Zuma, especially in Swaziland, and one got the view that there was a positive light around Zuma, that he was a calm man, accommodating, kind guy. And then one comes to the book, and it seems like it seems like there is a change. Where did one realize, what happened in the gap between the two books?
Well, I know Zuma from Durban in 1960, where I was working after having grown up in Joburg. And he was a trade unionist, 17-year-old. I'm 4 years older than Chris Hani, Zuma, and Mbeki. They were all born, and Paulo Jordan, they were all born in 1942, and I'm 1938, so I'm their senior.
The real good one.
And, so he was smart, committed young man who shone out. I meet him many years later in Maputo, where he's a leading person in the political work inside the country. And that is now in 1980, where I worked with Zuma there. Very engaging, and I enjoyed it at first. But I soon began to doubt him. And not because of greed for money. It didn't show. He was a very simple person in that respect. He drove a little Volkswagen Beetle around Maputo. He was seldom in a suit and tie and so on, dressed very simply. He was not a drinker. He wasn't extravagant in a lifestyle at all, and worked very hard. But then I started realizing that there were these other meetings he was engaging in, like secret meetings within our clandestine involvement of the movement, building an underground, and that was basically ethnic. And then other people would be talking, even leaders like Joe Modise and Joe Slovo, that Zuma's more just an ethnicist. He just wants to work with Zulus, really, and he's got his secret work about that. That's shocking, totally against what the ANC is about, totally. Yeah. It's like reactionary as it can come.
It's tribalism.
That was the aspect which one began to see. Coming back into the country, then something else kicks in. There are business people in our society as well as in the West who are now looking at this ANC emerging from exile or the underground. They are looking to see weak characters who would be susceptible to bribes. And you see somebody who's got 20 children or more, several wives, no bank account, no savings. We didn't live wealthy lives outside. That was a fantasy, a creation of the regime, the apartheid regime, to try and slander us. And it's well known that there are people in Durban who began to ply Zuma with funds. And they did this with others as well. So it's not just Zuma, but there are many people who are offered career choices, free education for their kids, nice cars bought for them.
Is this where the infiltration begins, at this era?
Absolutely, the whole gamut of what is corruption. And these people then become corrupt. They fall prey. And that's what's happened. That's the cancer that then spreads. And it's not that black people are just the ones who are corrupt. The corruptees are actually white business, from the very top echelon of business in South Africa and abroad, these countries. And that's why the poison has infected not just the ANC. I mean, some of these other organizations standing by Israel.
No, but I mean, some of them also do say that.
How much money are they all getting from the Zionist purse? Huge amounts.
Which we are going to come there now. But before that, with Zuma, what do you think his plan is? He wants to save ANC,
well, it's
MK.
Zuma he sticks to it. He wants power. He doesn't want to go to prison. He'll do everything possible not to, just like Trump and Netanyahu. If you have power and you're somebody who can mobilize forces in society, even the courts and the prosecution are rather wary, and the system can give you the breaks. There's nothing like the law serving rich people more than the poor. Okay, this is when we come into the question of the Freedom Charter and equality that we want to see in our country. So Zuma's actual objective is very simple. He wants to preserve his wealth and his freedom. He wants to gain power. He is clever in a very opportunistic and reactionary way, seeing that there is power in terms of an ethnicity. And he's not the only one. This populism, which we also see in other countries, and Trump is a prime example of white racists
Making
in
America
the USA.
great.
We see it in other countries, in Europe, for instance, or in Africa as well, let's say, any countries in the world, from Bolsonaro in Brazil to Modi in India and his preaching towards Hindu ethnicity and so on. So there's this ethnic factor in South Africa that people can play into, very dangerous, very reactionary, and that's his game, to get power and to be represented in Parliament, and the dream of coming back as a president, which he'll never see.
Yeah.
But this is, people become very arrogant, and it's a narcissism that Zuma suffers from, and people like him, and you see it with Trump, that they believe that they are above everybody else, cleverer than everybody else, can outsmart people, and will use any ploy, and especially this populism, this reactionary nationalism or ethnicity, and it's very clear where he has his basic power base and how he plays on that.
Okay. So now, I mean, when I reached out for the interview, there was one thing you were non-negotiable on, that if we're going to do this interview, you have to come out and brief us as to what's happening in Palestine, Gaza, Iran, the States. What's it about? What are they fighting for?
Well, at the root is again, what I've referred to in global terms and the division in the world. On the one hand, what we call imperialism, which is what colonialism has been at its base. The colonial empires crashed because of people's uprisings after the Second World War. These colonial empires became very weakened. The French, the British, the Japanese, the Spanish, the Portuguese, and so on. But we've seen for 5 centuries a world in which Europe, from which capitalism emerges, based on the slave trade and their supremacy as Europe over the rest of the world, and then the USA becoming the leading force representing the capitalist world. And against that are the former colonial powers, the Russian Revolution, which was a revolution against capital, the Chinese Revolution. So the question of how the world is in conflict between those of capital and imperialism, the highest stage in conquering the rest of the world for its resources, and the anti-imperialists, China amongst them as a leading force, not fighting to replace America and dominating the world. They haven't invaded countries. They don't have bases. America's got 800 bases around the world. Why?
China have a give and take.
To control the world in order to rob the people of the world of their wealth and resources, which makes Britain and France and Germany and the USA above all so strong and mighty. And within that then, that context, we come to understand the struggles between these two, NATO representing the West. And NATO is the key force, as we see, in its attacks through Europe on the Soviet Union when it existed, the communist world, the communist countries of Asia, from China to Vietnam to North Korea, and domination through the American empire and their bases, including Britain and France, who have, after America, they come second and third in the bases around the world, like about maybe 20, 30 each. The Americans 800, to control the trade routes, to ensure they have the hegemony and supremacy of the rest of the world.
And that is what President Putin is fighting when he attacked
Ukraine,
to prevent that.
Yes, exactly as you say, with Putin and Ukraine, because NATO, and so there we can even say NATO land, this alliance of the American empire and Western Europe and some of these states that were formerly communist and socialist in Europe, who were brought out of that system when the Soviet Union collapses. So this is NATO, that power. And in terms of this, you look at the resources of the world. You mentioned Russia. Russia's a sixth of the world. It's got incredible resources. The weaker Russia is, the more the West can plunder it and create a balkanization, such as they did in Yugoslavia, another former socialist country which they crushed. You look at the Middle East. You look from Palestine through Iraq and Iran to India and to where China is in the resources of the East. And therefore you see in Israel what Reagan had already called our battleship in the Middle East, our aircraft carrier, and Biden uses the same, and we see this with Trump. So the Palestinians, who were the indigenous people of Palestine and lived there for millennia, they are uprooted and they are attacked ever since Israel came into being, which is a settler colonial state of Jews from Europe essentially. pretending that this is their land because they use something that isn't history. And that's the Bible. That's fables in relation to faith, God, etc. It's people think that's history. It's not. They must realize it. But in terms of the Middle East and Palestine, which is so strategic, you've got the control of the area, especially if you've got now this particular state that you've built up with billions of dollars from America and Europe's support, Israel, to control as the policeman of the Middle East. And Iran is threatening that because Iran is the emergent regional power of that whole area. So the support for Palestine links into the domination of the Middle East and the whole of that region, going right through from Iran to India and beyond. And so any country in the world, you must ask yourselves, where does it figure in relation to the interests of France and Britain and Germany and the USA? And that's where you find the revolutions in Latin America through the centuries, and especially Cuba, that has survived, because the USA was, in terms of several hundreds of years after the Spanish colonizers had been weakened and crushed and lost power, and America then attempted to become the controller of Latin America, and did to quite a degree. Cuba was the revolution that opposed that, and Cuba has managed to survive against the blockade and the sanctions. The same applies Russia, China, North Korea. You see, where you're not strong enough, you're smashed, like Gaddafi, who tried to do that in Libya, in Iraq, Saddam Hussein, and they smash these countries, and you get chaos in those countries.
How safe are we? I mean, we took a stand with Palestine. Next thing, there's genocide.
Yeah.
And now we're seeing other countries getting bombed. How safe are we?
Well, we can't say that we're safe. The world is going through a very torrid period. The possibilities of nuclear war, because the Israelis are desperate. We've seen with the Americans, and the Americans, the only country in the world prepared to use nuclear bombs, the atomic bombs that were dropped on a Japan that was already finished. They couldn't fight any further in that Second World War. They were finished. The Americans tested their nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These are the brutes. These are the biggest danger, the most reactionary center of threat to the world is the USA, and with it, its allies in Europe, the NATO forces, which is why when we assess where we stand and who we should support, we look at the whole world and we see where is the center of reaction. It's Washington. And with Washington, it's control of Western Europe and more into Central and East on the borders of Russia, and conquering the rest of the world, or holding on, because, and this is the positive side, the masses around the world are in a state of movement, of uproar against the control of Western capitalist imperialism. And they see this, in addition, as the white people of white supremacy, because race has been used by those capitalist powers to make it more easy to suppress people of these continents, which are the brown people, the black people, and so on. So the race factor comes in, but its center is capitalism, and in its highest form, as Lenin pointed out, monopoly capitalism, imperialism, where they're using this military might and finance capital to control the world through force and through trade and through their currencies.
My final question. You mentioned earlier that basically everyone needs to pass the baton on. when you're passing the baton on, if you're now passing the baton on to future leaders, current leaders, what is the message you would put into that baton?
Well, quite interestingly, just a couple of weekends ago, the ANC Veterans League, who have very strong will and intent to pass on the baton so that the younger generation, the ANC Youth League and the youth generally, take up the principles, the morality, the aspirations of previous generations that fought through against colonialism, against apartheid, and broke through to create democracy and the possibility of real political and economic freedom and strength and power of our country in economic terms as well. For that we need the same qualities and values of the Chief Lutulis, the Bram Fishers, the Walter Sisulus,
Joe Slovos,
Chris Hanis.
I mean, but we have it in trio, right?
And that message is what's fundamental, so that we have a clarity of our understanding of who we are, what our country's about, and where we sit in the world, and where power can reside through international solidarity with all those fighting against the imperialists, and every country in their minds and their objectives is to create a strong, progressive, sovereign, independent country that will work with others. We see that in the global south, but we're not racists. We also see that there are social forces, working class, youth, women in the northern hemisphere that also have their problem against the self-same capitalism in the form of the Trumps and the Starmers in the UK and these dreadful leaders of France and Germany, etc. We see the uprising of people in those countries. So they are our allies too in the need to create a better world of our dreams. And we must know that our dreams aren't Mickey Mouse, they're not Disneyland. They're about the possibilities that human beings can create a better country where they live and a better world based on a common humanity, based on our need to ensure that the environment, the ecosystem of our planet is in the best possible health in terms of what is needed apropos of climate change and the environment for every living creature. Because the world is also in a terrible state, as we know, in terms of what the ravages of capitalism that are unchecked. So it covers everything from class struggle, from race domination, from the pollution of the planet to gender equality. And we all have in common, all the countries of the world have the main forces of their society, maybe not the top 10%, the top 1% that own more than half the wealth of the world. You know all these statistics. So we are the many, as Jeremy Corbyn points out, and they are the few. And if the world peoples can unite behind what are obvious and clear in terms of what the problem is, but the media controlled by these forces of reaction, unfortunately, they bamboozle people. And this is where political awareness must come to the fore in terms of study and understanding and analysis, what Karl Marx would refer to and did, that the philosophers have hitherto sought to understand the world. Okay, so that's knowledge, that's the information, etc. They've sought to understand the world, but the question is how to change it. The point is how to change it. So it's not that we say study and have a good political understanding. You've got to link that, merge that, the Marxist term, dialectically interconnected with the struggle of people, the practical struggle at the grassroots, at the regional levels, at the national, at the continental levels, where we create from country to country the force of the people that can conquer the power that's resided in a minority and use it for the benefit of all. That's what in a simple way, I'd end this interview. Young man, the baton goes to you.
Thank you. We take it, me and all of the viewers.
Thanks
and we
very
will do
much.
our best. But thank you. Thank you for making time. Thank you for being selfless. And engagement you had with Che in that interview. There was a quote that he had that I'd rather be a free man in my grave. And that seems to be a principle that you have honored, and we hope that continue to see it through you and your counterparts. You can also do the same. Like, subscribe, share, comment. Let us know what you want to hear. And thanks a lot, guys. Palatable Politics.